I was 21 when this happened. I was in my third year of college, living off campus in a part of the city that wasn't bad exactly, but got quiet in a way that made you walk a little faster at night. It was a mid-sized city, the kind where everything stays open just late enough for people to convince themselves it's safer than it is. I worked evening shifts at a restaurant downtown 5 nights a week. Nothing fancy. Just a place that stayed busy because it was near bars, a theater, and a campus shuttle stop. I usually got off sometime between 10:30 and midnight, depending on whether we closed on time, whether somebody called out, whether a big group came in 10 minutes before the kitchen shut down. It changed enough that I couldn't really rely on a bus, and I didn't have a car, so most nights I took a rideshare home. It was always the same route. From the restaurant through a strip of older commercial blocks across a wide intersection by a gas station, then into the neighborhood where my apartment was. The ride was usually around 12 minutes, maybe 15 if lights were bad. For the first couple months, I didn't think much about any of the drivers. They blurred together after a while. Same questions. Busy night? You in school? You heading home from work? Sometimes I'd answer. Usually I'd just say I was tired and keep looking at my phone. Then one night, around the end of October, I got picked up by a man named Daniel. At least that's what the app said. The car listed was a dark blue Honda Civic. The one that pulled up looked black at first, but it was raining lightly and everything on that street looked darker than it was. I checked the plate. It matched except for one letter at the end. I remember staring at it longer than I normally would. The driver noticed and rolled the passenger window down a few inches. "Pickup for Emma?" I said yeah. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds, then got in. I told myself I had probably read the plate wrong, or maybe the app hadn't updated. I'd already had drivers show up in substitute cars before. Usually they explained right away. This guy didn't, but he didn't seem nervous about it either. He just drove. He was probably in his 40s. Quiet. Normal voice, clean car, no music playing. For the first few minutes, nothing about the ride felt wrong. He asked if the restaurant had been busy. I said it had. He asked if I worked there full time. I said no, just around classes. That was it. When we got near my neighborhood, he asked, "You still want the corner?" I looked up from my phone. "What?" "The corner by the laundromat," he said. "Or right in front tonight?" I remember feeling embarrassed before I felt alarmed. I thought maybe I'd forgotten that I had him before. I said the corner is fine. He nodded like that settled it, and a minute later he dropped me off where I always got dropped off, near the laundromat on the main road, about half a block from my apartment building. I didn't think about it much after that. The job had me exhausted all the time, and weird little details didn't stay in my head unless they had to. But 4 nights later, I ordered another ride after my shift, and when the car accepted, the account name was Marcus. Different photo, different car too. A gray Toyota Corolla. When it pulled up, the car was a gray Toyota Corolla. That part matched. But when I got in and he said hello, I knew it was the same man. Not because his face looked exactly like the photo, it didn't. The app photo had been darker and lower quality, but the voice was the same. Same age, same build, same calm way of talking. I sat down and shut the door, then checked the app again while he pulled away. I almost asked him if he'd driven me before, but something about that felt awkward, so I didn't. A few blocks into the ride, he said, "Longer shift tonight," not in a conversational way, more like a comment. I said, "Yeah." He said, "Thursdays are always bad for restaurants," I said, "Usually." Then he said, "At least you got out early on Sunday." I looked up from my lap. I know exactly why I remember that sentence. Because on Sunday I had gotten cut early, but I never ordered a ride. One of my coworkers had driven me home after her shift because she lived near campus. I hadn't stood outside. I hadn't requested a car. I hadn't even opened the app. I tried to make sense of it quickly and quietly. Maybe he was guessing. Maybe he had confused me with someone else. Maybe he meant another Sunday, I said. I didn't work that late Sunday. He looked at me in the mirror for half a second. "Right," he said, "that's what I mean." Then he kept driving. I told myself there had to be some normal explanation. Drivers probably saw canceled requests. Maybe I had opened the app at some point without realizing. Maybe the restaurant had enough regular staff and customers coming and going that he was mixing up details from different people. That was how I got through the rest of that ride. At the corner, I got out, said thanks, and walked home without looking back. After that, I started paying closer attention, not in a panicked way, more in the way you do when something starts to bother you but you're still trying to stay reasonable about it. Over the next 2 weeks, I saw him 3 more times, each time under a different name. Once as Kevin in a silver Hyundai, once as Luis in a white Nissan, and once under a woman's name, which was the only time I almost canceled before he got there. That time, the app showed a white Kia and a woman named Alina. The car that pulled up was a white Kia. Close enough, same model, maybe 1 year older than the one in the app picture. I leaned down to look through the windshield before opening the door, expecting there to be some explanation. It was him. He gave me a small, patient smile through the glass, like I was taking too long over something routine. I almost stepped back onto the sidewalk and canceled. I should have. But it was just after midnight. I was standing outside with 2 other restaurants closing around me, and I had that same thought again, the one I hate now. That I was probably being paranoid. I got in. As soon as I shut the door, he said, "Different account tonight. My sister's helping me out." I hadn't asked. I just said, "Oh." He drove one-handed for a few seconds, then adjusted the vent toward me. "Cold out now," he said. I didn't answer. For most of the ride, he didn't talk. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. It was the opposite. It felt like he knew he didn't need to say much anymore. When we got near my apartment, he slowed slightly before the usual corner and said, "You can get out here if you want. It's closer to the back way." I said, "The corner is fine." He nodded, like before, but then he said, very casually, "The street behind your building is darker anyway." I didn't say anything. I don't even remember getting out of the car. I remember shutting the door. I remember walking to the corner. I remember not turning around. But I don't remember my feet touching the ground after that first step. The street behind my building was not where I got dropped off. It wasn't on my route home from the corner either. I only used it if I came back from the campus side during the day because it led to the rear entrance and dumpsters and a side gate that was sometimes unlocked. I had never mentioned it to any driver. And after that ride, I finally did what I should have done the second time. I reported the account. I didn't go into every detail because I was worried I'd sound unstable. I just said the driver did not appear to match the profile and that I believed the same person had been using multiple accounts. I included dates as best as I could remember and said one account may have belonged to someone else. I got back a generic message saying they took safety seriously and would investigate. Nothing else happened. No follow-up. No phone call. No request for more information. I kept using the app for another week, but only when I absolutely had to, and every time a ride got assigned to me, my stomach dropped until the car arrived. I didn't get him again during that week. Then finals got closer, I picked up fewer shifts, and for a while it seemed like the whole thing might just fade out on its own. But it didn't really fade out. I started noticing things at work. Nothing dramatic. Nothing I could point to and say, "There, that's proof." Just small things. Once, the host told me a man had come in around 4, asking if we were hiring and whether our late shift usually kept the same staff every week. She only mentioned it because he hadn't ordered anything and left after a minute. Another time, one of the cooks said, "Your ride's here," and pointed out front around 11:30. I looked through the window and there was a dark sedan idling by the curb. I couldn't see the driver clearly, and I hadn't ordered a ride yet. By the time I got to the door, the car was gone. I stopped using rideshare after that. For almost 3 weeks, I found other ways home. If a coworker was heading near campus, I asked for a ride. If nobody was, I took the bus as far as I could and walked the rest with my phone in my hand. Twice, I paid one of the line cooks gas money to take me home because he lived in the next neighborhood over. It was inconvenient and expensive and made me feel stupid because saying the full reason out loud made it sound thin. Like the kind of thing people nod at without really believing. A driver who might be the same guy keeps picking me up under different names. He asks things he shouldn't know. He acts like we've had conversations we never had. Nothing had happened, technically. That was the problem. There was never enough to turn into a single clean story. By then it was December. Colder, darker, wetter. My finals were ending, the restaurant was understaffed, and one Friday night I got stuck there much later than I planned because a private party stayed past close and we had to reset part of the dining room before leaving. By the time I clocked out, it was raining hard. Not a storm, just steady, miserable rain that soaked through your sleeves in under a minute. I stood under the awning with my hood up, checking the bus times, and realized I'd be waiting almost 40 minutes for the next one. The line cook who sometimes drove me had already left. 2 coworkers had gone to a bar. One server offered to split a ride with me halfway, but she lived in the opposite direction and had already booked hers. I remember looking at the rideshare app for a long time before opening it. Then I told myself I was overreacting. 3 weeks had gone by. Maybe the reports worked. Maybe he'd never been anything more than a weird guy gaming the app with borrowed accounts. Maybe I had built the rest into something bigger because I was tired and usually alone at night, so I requested a ride. It matched almost immediately. The name on the account was Teresa. The car listed was a dark green Subaru. I actually laughed a little when I saw the name, just out of nerves. Then I looked at the driver photo. It was too small and grainy to make out much. The arrival time said 2 minutes. I waited under the awning with my backpack against my chest and watched headlights pass through the rain. Then a dark sedan pulled up, not a Subaru. Not green either. Black, or maybe dark blue under the streetlights. For a second I thought it had to be for someone else. Then the app notification buzzed and said, "Your driver has arrived." I didn't move. The windshield wipers kept going. The car idled at the curb. After maybe 10 seconds, the passenger window lowered. And there he was. Same man. Same neutral expression. Rain ticking on the roof. He leaned slightly toward the window and said, almost kindly, "You can come on. You're getting soaked." I had not stepped out from under the awning. I was dry. I think that was the moment something changed for me. Not because it was the worst thing he'd done, but because of how ordinary he sounded. Like this had all been settled already, like I was the one making it awkward by hesitating. I stood there with my phone in my hand, and he looked at me the way someone might look at a regular customer who's taking too long to decide whether to get in. Then he said, "It's the same way home." I wish I could say I did something smart right then. I didn't. I didn't confront him. I didn't take a picture. I didn't walk back inside and call the police. I canceled the ride. Just canceled it while he was still sitting there. My phone buzzed with the fee warning. I hit confirm anyway. His face didn't change. For 1 second I thought he might get out. Instead, he looked down, probably at his own phone, then back at me. The window stayed open a few inches. "You sure?" he asked. I didn't answer. Then he said, "You'll be waiting a while." Still calm, still not quite impolite. I backed toward the restaurant door and went inside. One of the bartenders was still counting out a drawer. She looked up and asked if I forgot something. I told her my ride was weird and asked if I could stay until another one came. She said of course. When I looked back out through the front window, his car was still there. Not directly in front anymore, across the street. Wipers moving. No hazard lights. No obvious reason to be parked there. I stayed inside for 15 minutes, maybe 20. The bartender kept glancing up like she was trying not to make me more nervous than I already was. Eventually the car pulled away. I didn't order another rideshare. I called my manager, who had just gotten home, and I think hearing my voice made him realize something was actually wrong because he came back and drove me home himself without arguing about it. On the way, I told him most of it. Not every little detail, but enough. He asked if I wanted to make a police report. I said I didn't know what I would even report. He said start with all of it. The next morning, I did. I went to the station with screenshots I'd started taking after the 3rd or 4th time I saw him. Different account names, different cars, pickup times, a few ride summaries. The generic support response from the app. The officer I spoke to wasn't dismissive, exactly. But I could tell he was trying to fit it into a category that would let him tell me what to do next. Did he threaten you? No. Did he touch you? No. Did he come to your residence? Not that I knew of. Did he contact you outside the app? No. Did he follow you after drop-off? I didn't know. That one I hated answering the most, because the honest answer was that if he had, I might not have noticed. I always walked home from the corner without looking back. They took the information. They told me to keep documenting everything. They said if I saw him again, or if he appeared near my apartment or workplace, I should call right away. I also contacted the rideshare company again. This time I was more direct. I said I believed one individual was using multiple accounts, possibly fraudulent ones, and had demonstrated knowledge of my routines beyond what would be expected from normal rides. I said I had filed a police report. That got a less generic response, but not by much. They told me the matter was being escalated. I never learned what that meant. Winter break started a few days later, and I went home to stay with my mother for almost 2 weeks. When I came back in January, I moved. Not because anyone told me to, not because there was a confirmed threat. My lease was ending in a few months anyway, and one of my friends needed a roommate closer to campus. So I used that as my reason. It was easier to say I was moving for practical reasons. I quit the restaurant too, again, practical reasons. Hard semester. Too far from the new place. Not enough time. All technically true. I didn't see him again after that. At least, not in any way I could prove, but there are two things I still think about. The first happened about a month after I moved. I was meeting a friend for coffee near campus, and as I was crossing the street I saw a dark sedan stopped at the light. Older model, clean. Nothing distinctive except that something about the driver's profile caught my attention. I slowed down without meaning to. The man in the car never turned fully toward me. The light changed, and he drove off. I can't honestly say it was him. What bothered me was that my first thought wasn't uncertainty. My first thought was recognition. The second thing happened later that spring when I was going through old emails and found one from the rideshare company with an update to a previous safety concern. It was automated, no name attached. It thanked me for my patience and said they had reviewed the information associated with my report. For privacy and safety reasons, they couldn't share the outcome of any action taken on another user's account. Another user's account. Singular. I read that line over and over. Not accounts, not reports. Account. Maybe that was just standard wording. It probably was. But I kept thinking about all the names I'd seen. All the cars that almost matched. All the times I got in because things were just close enough that I could talk myself past it. And I still do that now, even years later, if I'm somewhere at night waiting for a car. I check the plate more than once. I check the make and model. I look at the driver before I open the door, and if anything is even slightly off, I cancel. I don't care if it costs me money. I don't care if I feel rude. I don't care if the driver looks annoyed. Because the part that stayed with me was never the idea that he might do something obvious. It was the feeling that he was patient, that he understood how easy it was to let small things slide when you were tired and alone, and trying not to be difficult. That he knew most people don't react to one strange detail, or two. They react when there's finally enough to say out loud. And by then, if someone has been paying attention to you for long enough, they probably know exactly how long that will take. I used to drive rideshare a few nights a week for extra money. Not full-time. Just enough to cover groceries, gas, and whatever random bill came up that month. I usually drove after my regular job, mostly on weekdays, because the money was steadier and the passengers were easier. Airport runs, restaurant pickups, people coming home from work, that kind of thing. I avoided the late weekend crowd when I could. Drunk people, arguments, people throwing up in the back seat. I learned pretty quickly that the best nights were the boring ones. This happened on a Tuesday in November. It was cold enough that people were already hurrying from store to car with their shoulders up and their heads down. Not snowing yet, but close. The kind of night where everything looked damp and flat under parking lot lights. I had been driving for about 3 hours and was getting ready to call it. It was a little after 9:30. I was parked near a grocery store on the edge of town because that area usually gave me one last decent trip before I went home. A request came in from that store. The pickup point was at the front entrance, near the cart return. The name on the account was Evelyn. I pulled up and saw an older woman standing alone under the lights with 2 reusable grocery bags at her feet. She looked to be maybe late 60s, early 70s. Nothing unusual about her. Dark coat, knit hat, one of those folding shopping carts collapsed beside her. She wasn't waving or looking around nervously. She just watched my car approach like she'd been waiting exactly where she was supposed to. I got out and helped her with the bags. She thanked me. Very normal, very polite. Her voice was clear and calm. Not shaky, not confused. She got into the back seat behind me, set the bags beside her, and gave me one of those careful smiles older people sometimes give when they don't want to seem like a burden. Before I started driving, I asked, "You Evelyn?" She said yes. Then I asked, "Just heading to the address in the app?" There was a pause. Not long, but enough for me to notice it. Then she said, "Yes, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't say it out loud." I remember glancing at her in the mirror. She was looking out the passenger side window when she said it, like it was nothing. Like some people might ask for the radio down or the heat up, I said, "Sure, no problem." I figured maybe she was just private. Some people are weird about that stuff, especially older passengers. I'd had people lower their voices to say apartment numbers before, or ask me not to stop directly in front of the building. Nothing about it struck me as serious yet. I started the trip and pulled out of the lot. For the first few minutes, she made normal small talk. Asked if I'd been busy, if I drove nights often, if the cold weather made business better or worse. She didn't sound distracted. If anything, she sounded like someone making a point of sounding normal. We hit a red light about half a mile from the store, and that was when she leaned forward slightly and said, in a quieter voice, "When we get close, I need you to do me a favor." I said, "Okay." She said, "Please don't stop in front of my building." I looked at her in the mirror again. This time she was watching me, not the window. I asked if there was construction or something. She said, "No, I'd just rather you didn't." I told her that was fine. I said I could stop wherever she wanted. She nodded once and sat back again. That should have been the end of it, but then maybe 30 seconds later she added, "If possible, I'd like you to pass it first. Then go around the block and let me out behind it, in the alley." She said it carefully, like she had already worked out the route in her head. That was the first point where I started thinking she might be one of those passengers who had gotten deep into some neighborhood drama, or thought somebody was out to get them when really it was just a misunderstanding. I've had a few like that. Not many, but enough that you remember the tone. I said that's a little unusual. She gave a short nod like she agreed. Then she said, "I know how it sounds." I didn't answer right away. After a second, she said, "I think someone has access to my account." That got my attention, but not in the way she probably meant it. I assumed she meant fraud. Maybe someone had used her card, or signed into an app somewhere. I asked if she'd called support. She said I changed my password twice. Then she looked down at her phone, which she had been holding face down in both hands, and said, "I don't think they're after my money." I said, "Then what are they after?" She took a second before answering. "I think they've been using it to see when I leave home, and when I come back." I didn't know what to say to that. I kept driving. Traffic was light. We were moving through a stretch of low office buildings and dark storefronts, heading toward one of the older apartment areas near downtown. I could see her in the rearview mirror every few seconds. She wasn't panicking, she wasn't rambling. If anything, that made it harder to read. People who are truly confused usually over-explain. She wasn't doing that. She was picking her words very carefully. I asked her how someone would do that. She said, "By requesting rides on my account. Not always taking them. Just setting pickup points. Watching what updates appear." I said, "Wouldn't you get notifications?" "I do." That answer came fast. Then she added, "Sometimes after, sometimes not at all. Sometimes I see a canceled trip in my history that I didn't order." I said maybe it was a glitch. She didn't argue with me. She just said, "That's what I hoped." We drove another couple of minutes without talking. I remember thinking I'd just get her there, drop her off where she wanted, and move on. I wasn't scared. Mostly I was wondering whether this would turn into one of those trips where a passenger tries to get you involved in something personal and messy. As we got closer to the address, she leaned forward again. "Please," she said, "when we turn onto my street, don't slow down." I said, "All right. And don't look directly at the entrance." That one I almost laughed at, but I caught myself because her tone hadn't changed at all. I said, "Why?" She answered, "Because if I'm wrong, then I'm just an old woman wasting your time." Then she said, "And if I'm not wrong, I don't want it to look like you've noticed anything." That was probably the first sentence that actually made me uneasy, not because it proved anything, but because it was the kind of thing a rational person says when they're trying very hard not to sound irrational. We turned onto her street. It was a block of older brick apartment buildings with narrow front steps, weak porch lights, and cars parked bumper to bumper along both curbs. The streetlights there were spaced too far apart, so every other section of sidewalk fell into shadow. A lot of people in that neighborhood kept their blinds closed, so most of the windows were dark. My app showed the destination on the right side, halfway down the block. I kept my speed steady. I didn't stop, and I didn't turn my head, but I could still see enough in my peripheral vision to make out the entrance. Small awning over the front steps. Glass door. One light on in the lobby. At the far end of the block, maybe 3 buildings past hers, there was a sedan parked on the opposite side, facing the wrong direction for that side of the street. Its lights were off. That by itself didn't mean much. People park badly all the time, but it was one of the only occupied-looking cars on the block. I could see the shape of someone in the driver's seat, though not clearly enough to say anything about them. I turned at the corner. As soon as we were out of sight of the building, the woman said, very quietly, "Thank you, not relieved, just controlled." I circled the block the way she asked. The rear alley ran behind a row of garages and trash enclosures. It wasn't pitch black, but it was dim enough that my headlights did most of the work. There was a side entrance halfway down with a metal security door and a yellow light above it. She told me to stop there. I put the car in park. Before either of us moved, my phone made the sound for a new ride request. Normally I wouldn't even have looked at it right then because I was still on an active trip. But the timing was strange enough that I glanced at the screen mounted on my dash. It was a scheduled pickup request, immediate, and the name on it was Evelyn. Same rating. Same account name. The pickup pin was set at the front entrance of the building we had just passed. For a second I honestly thought the app had glitched and duplicated the current ride. Then I looked back at the trip still running on my screen. Her ride was still active. Same name in the corner. Same route. Still in progress. I felt my stomach drop a little. I turned around and held up the phone so she could see it. "Is this you?" She looked at the screen, and I watched whatever small amount of doubt I still had disappear from her face. She didn't look surprised. That was the worst part. She just closed her eyes for a second and said, "No." I asked if anyone else had access to her phone. She said no. I asked if she'd shared the account with family. She said no again, sharper this time. Then she looked over her shoulder through the rear window and said, "Please cancel it, and please don't leave me here yet." That was enough for me. I canceled the incoming request. Almost immediately, I got the usual warning screen about acceptance rate and too many cancellations. I barely read it, I just cleared it and locked the doors without really thinking about it. I asked her if she wanted me to call the police. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And tell them what?" I didn't have a good answer, because she was right. At that point, what did we actually have? An odd request from a passenger. A second ride ping under the same name. A pickup pin at her own building. Maybe account fraud, maybe stalking, maybe some app problem I didn't understand. Nothing I could explain in a way that wouldn't make me sound like I was guessing. I asked if she had someone she could call. She said, "Not nearby." Then she added, "Drive out to the main road first." I put the car back in drive and rolled forward through the alley. At the end of it, I stopped before turning onto the next street and checked my mirrors. I don't know what I expected to see. At first, nothing looked wrong. Then, when I turned right and started toward the light, I saw headlights come on behind one of the garages farther down the side street. Not bright, just standard low beams. A car pulled out slowly, turned the same direction we had, and stayed back. Could have been anyone. That's what I told myself. We reached the main road, and there was more traffic there. Not much, but enough to break things up. I merged in and drove about 2 blocks without saying anything. The woman in back had both hands on her bags now, holding the straps tight. At the next light, I checked the mirror again. The same car had made it through behind us. Dark sedan, older model. Couldn't tell the make. It wasn't close enough to be obvious. There were two other cars between us. If I hadn't already been looking for it, I probably wouldn't have noticed it at all. I asked her, "Do you know that car?" She didn't lean over or try to get a better look. She just said, "I don't know who drives it." That wasn't an answer I liked. The light turned green. I kept going straight another half-mile, then took a right I didn't need to take. Not sudden, just enough to test it. The sedan turned too, still not close. Still with another car between us for part of it. That's what made it hard to trust my own read on the situation. Anybody can be behind you for a few turns in a city. It happens all the time. If someone tailgates you, that's one thing. But if they hang back just enough, you start feeling stupid even thinking it. I asked her how long this had been going on. She said, "A few weeks." Why keep using the app? Because if I stop doing normal things all at once, then I know I'm not imagining it. I actually thought about that for a second. I'm still not sure what she meant. Maybe that if the activity continued while she kept living normally, it proved something. Or maybe she just didn't want her whole life shaped around a suspicion she couldn't prove. Either way, she said it like she'd already had the argument with herself many times. I asked if she'd seen anyone around her building. She said yes. I asked if it was the same person. She said, "Sometimes I think so. Then I'm not sure." We came to another light. I checked again. The sedan stopped farther back this time, almost too far to look connected to us at all. No high beams, no sudden moves. Just there. I said, "I really think we should call someone." And she said, "Drive to a gas station." There was one open a mile ahead at a busy intersection. I headed there. The whole way, that car stayed in the background, not always directly behind me. Once it was in the lane over, once a pickup truck blocked it completely for a minute. Then it was there again at the next light. Every time I nearly convinced myself it was random, it stayed with us through one more turn. I pulled into the gas station under the bright canopy lights and stopped near the front of the store where the security cameras were obvious. For the first time that night, the woman seemed unsure of what to do next. She looked out at the store, then at the pumps, then back at me. I said, "Do you want me to go inside with you?" She said no. Then after a second she said, "Actually, yes, if that's all right." I told her of course. I parked, got out, and took one quick look back toward the road. The sedan had passed the entrance without turning in. It kept going straight. I should have felt better at that point, but I didn't. Inside the store, the cashier barely looked up from his phone. There were two other customers by the coffee machines. The woman stood beside me near the counter and asked if she could stay there for a minute before requesting another ride later, maybe from a different account. I told her she didn't need another ride. I said I could wait until she called someone, or I could take her to a police station or anywhere else she felt safe. She thanked me, but in a way that sounded distracted. Then she asked to borrow a pen. The cashier handed her one. She tore a strip off the back of a grocery receipt from her pocket and wrote something on it with one hand covering the paper from view. Then she folded it twice and handed it to me. She said, "If anyone asks whether you drove me home tonight, say no." I stared at her for a second. I said, "What is this?" She told me not to open it there. That was the exact moment I stopped feeling like I was helping with a strange passenger situation, and started feeling like I had been placed inside something that had already been going on long before I picked her up. I asked her directly, "Are you in danger?" She gave me a tired look more than a scared one. Then she said, "I don't know yet." That answer bothered me more than if she just said yes, because yes would have meant there was a clear problem, a thing you could name. This felt different, like she was still waiting for enough pieces to line up to call it real. She asked if I could end the trip there instead of at her address. I told her I could. Before I did, I asked one more time if she wanted police. She looked through the front windows toward the road and said, "Not until I know what I'm reporting." So I ended the trip at the gas station. The fare adjusted automatically. A minute later, I got the rating prompt, then the usual option to thank the rider or move on. I put my phone in my pocket and stayed there with her another 10 minutes while she made a call from inside the store. She didn't say much on it. Mostly just, "Can I come now?" and "No, not there, and I'll explain when I get there." Eventually someone agreed to pick her up. While we waited, I finally unfolded the paper she'd given me. It had one name on it, not hers, just a man's full name and, under it, apartment 3B. No explanation. I looked up at her and she saw that I'd opened it. She said very quietly, "That's the tenant directly above me." I asked what that meant. She said, "Maybe nothing." Then she took the paper back and folded it again. A woman in an SUV arrived about 15 minutes later. Middle-aged, tense, not friendly. She didn't get out at first. The older woman picked up her bags, thanked me again, and before leaving said, "If the company contacts you about a second request from my account, don't tell them where you dropped me." Then she left. I watched her get into the SUV and drive off. That should have been the end of it. But on my way home, maybe 20 minutes later, I stopped at a red light about 3 miles from the gas station and saw that same dark sedan in the lane across from me, facing the opposite direction. I can't prove it was the same one. Same shape, same color, same kind of dull headlights. That was all. But as I sat there, the driver turned their head slightly toward me. Not enough for me to make out a face, just enough to make me sure they were looking into my car. The light changed. They didn't go right away, neither did I. Then they moved, and I moved, and we went opposite directions. I kept checking my mirrors all the way home. Nothing followed me after that. The next morning I half expected some kind of message from the app about the duplicate request or the cancellation. I didn't get one. I checked my trip history, and only the completed ride to the gas station was there. Nothing else under her name. No second request in my notifications. No trace of it. I even contacted driver support later that day, mostly because I wanted some record of what happened, in case it turned into something bigger. The person I got clearly had no idea what I was talking about. They just repeated that canceled requests don't always remain visible, and asked if I felt unsafe during a trip. I said yes. They sent a generic safety response, and that was it. A week went by, then another. I kept wondering whether I should have written down the plate from that sedan, except I never got close enough to read it. That's the part that stays with me. Whoever it was, if it was anyone, stayed just far enough back to make me doubt myself. About 3 weeks later, I got a pickup a few blocks from that same grocery store. Different passenger, different time, middle of the afternoon. On the way there, I passed the older woman's apartment building without meaning to notice it. There was a printed notice taped inside the front glass door. I only caught part of it as I drove by, but it looked like one of those building management notices about police assistance or entry access. Something official enough that people would stop to read it. I thought about pulling over. I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to insert myself into it again. Maybe because I was afraid that if I confirmed something had happened, it would make the whole thing settle into place in a way I didn't want. I never saw her again. A couple months after that, I stopped driving rideshare at night. Not because of this exactly, at least that's what I told myself. It was winter, work got busier, the money wasn't worth the wear on my car. All of that was true, but I also started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. How often passengers say, "Just drop me around the corner." How many apartment buildings have dark cars sitting across from them with no lights on? How easy it is for someone to know your routines if they only need to be right a few times. And how, if they're careful, almost everything they do can look ordinary from the outside. I still think about that second ride request. Not the fact that it came in. The location? Pinned exactly where she told me not to stop. That was the part I couldn't explain away, because if someone was just messing with her account, that would be strange enough. But whoever sent it either knew where she lived already, or needed to know whether she had made it home, and I still don't know which is worse. I flew in for my uncle's funeral in late November. His service was the next morning, in the town where my mother grew up. I hadn't been back there in years. It's the kind of place people leave and only return to for weddings, hospital visits, and funerals. In my case, it was the last one. My flight got delayed twice because of weather farther up the coast. By the time we landed, it was after midnight. The airport wasn't in the town itself. It was in the nearest small city, about 40 minutes away on a good night, longer if there was construction or if you got stuck behind freight traffic coming through the highway split. I'd planned to rent a car, but the counter had closed by the time I got there. So I stood near baggage claim with my carry-on and ordered a rideshare to the motel my mother had booked for me. I remember checking the app carefully because it was late and I was tired. The driver's name was Daniel, dark SUV. The profile photo showed a white guy in his late 30s maybe, short beard, tired-looking eyes, baseball cap, normal-looking, the kind of face you forget right away. Pickup was listed at the passenger loading area outside door C. I went out there with maybe 6 or 7 other people scattered along the curb. Most of them got picked up within a few minutes. After that it got quiet fast. Airports feel different after midnight. Even when there are lights everywhere, it starts to feel temporary, like the building is only pretending to stay awake. I checked the app again, 2 minutes away. Then a dark SUV pulled up in front of me. I looked at the plate first. It was close enough to what I expected that I thought maybe I'd misremembered the last 2 characters. Same color, same make. Similar driver. The man behind the wheel leaned across and cracked the passenger window. "Chris?" "That's my name." I said, "Yeah." He unlocked the back door. I put my bag in and got in without thinking much about it. That part bothers me now, how little it took. He had the right general face, the right vehicle, and he said my name first. At that hour, with a funeral the next morning and not much sleep, that was enough. As soon as I shut the door, he looked at me in the mirror and said, "Been a while." I thought he was just making conversation, so I gave him the kind of answer you give when you don't want to talk. "Yeah, long trip." He nodded like that, confirmed something. "You're in for the service?" I assumed he meant because of the suit bag folded beside me and because people fly into that airport for funerals all the time. There are a lot of little towns spread around out there. Old families, old cemeteries, so I said, "Tomorrow morning." He made a quiet sound like he already knew that. He pulled away from the curb and merged out with no issue. The airport road was almost empty. A few taxis, 1 shuttle bus, a pickup truck with a ladder rack. Nothing strange, nothing dramatic. That's important, I think. If he had acted wrong right away, I would have noticed it. Instead, he acted just familiar enough to make me feel like I was the one forgetting something. After maybe 2 minutes, he said, "I heard they're burying him up on the hill." I asked, "Sorry?" "At the cemetery, near the church." I sat forward a little. "How'd you know where I'm headed?" He shrugged. "Small town." That was true, technically. The motel was on the edge of town, not far from the cemetery road. People there know each other's business. Obituaries get posted fast. If he drove nights, maybe he really had heard about it. I said, "You from there?" "Used to be around there a lot." That answer was vague enough that I didn't know what to do with it. He drove one-handed, relaxed, like he'd taken this route 100 times. We passed the closed gas stations and chain restaurants around the airport exit, then the road opened up and got darker. I looked down at my phone once. I didn't notice anything wrong at the time. I just saw the route line and the battery percentage and a text from my mother asking if I'd landed. I texted back, "Just got in the car. Be there soon." Then I put my phone away. The driver said, "Your mom's still over on Linden?" That got my attention. I asked him what he meant. He said, "Last I remember, that side of the family had a place off Linden Road. Maybe I've got it mixed up. My mother had grown up on Linden Road. Not currently, not for decades. But that was the road." I stared at the back of his head for a second and tried to place him. There was nothing distinctive there. Clean jacket, ball cap, no accent that stood out. Just a local voice. I said, "Did you know my family?" He gave a short laugh, not like something was funny, more like he didn't want to answer directly. "People know people around here." I remember thinking, maybe he had gone to school with one of my cousins. Maybe he knew my uncle. Maybe he'd seen my name on the app and connected it to the obituary because the family name isn't common outside that county. That was all possible. I told myself that was all it was. A few miles later, he said, "Main road's torn up tonight. I'm gonna cut through County 8. I looked out and saw one of those temporary orange construction signs ahead, tipped slightly sideways in the wind. So again, it sounded reasonable. He took the exit and we ended up on a narrower road lined with dark fields and the backs of industrial buildings. There were long stretches with no streetlights. I asked if this was the fastest way. He said, "At this hour, yeah." Then after a pause, he added, "Unless you're in a hurry to get there." The way he said it wasn't threatening. It was almost casual, but it felt off. I said, "Not really." He nodded once in the mirror. The thing is, unease doesn't always arrive all at once. Sometimes it builds because each new detail is still explainable, but it forces the last one to sit differently in your head. That's what the ride felt like. Nothing I could point to. Just one small thing, then another. He asked whether the wake had been crowded. I said I hadn't been there for it. He said, "Right. You were always the one coming in late." I remember the exact cold feeling I got from that sentence. Not panic. More like my body briefly went alert before my brain had caught up. I said, "I think you've got me mixed up with somebody." He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Maybe." No apology. No correction. Just maybe. After that I opened the app again. I wish I could say I immediately saw that something was wrong, but I didn't. I was tired, and I wasn't looking at it with suspicion yet. I mostly checked the little moving map. My signal was weak on that road, and the screen hesitated before loading. I saw my location, the destination, and what looked like the route. That was enough to reassure me for the moment. I sent another text to my mother on the way, about half an hour. Then I looked up and noticed we were passing a volunteer fire station I remembered from when I was a kid. That bothered me because it meant we were farther east than I expected. Not wildly off course. Just off enough that I asked about it. He said, "Detour put us around the backside. Comes out near the cemetery." Again, a reasonable answer. He didn't speed. He didn't lock the doors. He didn't ask for money. He didn't say anything openly threatening. That almost made it worse. If someone acts dangerous, your mind has something solid to react to. When they don't, you start negotiating with your own instincts. I told myself I was tired and grieving and being oversensitive because I hadn't been back in that area in years. Then he said, "I saw the obituary this afternoon. Your family used the older photo." I felt my stomach drop a little. My uncle's obituary had used an older picture. One from maybe 15 years ago. I knew that because my mother had complained about it on the phone, said my cousin picked one where he looked too healthy. I asked, "How do you know my family name?" He met my eyes in the mirror for maybe 1 second. Same way everybody else does. That doesn't answer the question. He turned his attention back to the road. "No," he said. "I guess it doesn't." I thought about asking him to pull over right then. I really did, but we were on a dark county road after midnight, between places, and I had no clear reason to escalate things except that I felt uneasy. He had my destination in the app. He knew the area. We were still generally headed toward town. I kept telling myself there was a normal explanation just outside my grasp. That's the part I hate admitting. I stayed because leaving felt more awkward than dangerous. I think a lot of people do that. After that, neither of us talked for a while. I watched road signs pass in the headlights. Some I recognized. Some I didn't. There were occasional houses set way back from the road with a porch light on, and once we passed a cemetery gate on the left, smaller than the one I was going near. Just a local churchyard with a handful of headstones, lit white for a second in the beams. Then he said, without turning around, "You were close with him?" I knew he meant my uncle. I said, "Close enough." He nodded. He had that land for a long time. That was true too. My uncle had owned a few acres outside town. Not a farm exactly, just inherited property with a collapsing shed and a stand of trees. I had been there as a kid maybe twice. At that point I stopped trying to explain how he knew things and started focusing on getting to the motel. I shared my trip status with my sister through text, mostly to make myself feel less alone. Then I typed out, "Drivers being weird. Might know the family." I didn't send that one. It sounded stupid even to me. A few minutes later we came up on town limits. I recognized the closed hardware store, the empty diner parking lot, the war memorial at the four-way stop. He turned the wrong direction for the motel, or what I thought was the wrong direction, and before I could say anything, he told me there was overnight paving near the main intersection. "There's a back way in behind the laundromat," he said. There was, actually. I remembered it as soon as he said it. So again, he was right. That's what made the whole thing so hard to pin down. Every time I thought, that's the moment this stops making sense, he'd say something that did make sense. He pulled into the motel lot a few minutes later. It was one of those two-story roadside places with exterior doors and a blinking vacancy sign that looked half broken. My mother had booked it because it was clean enough and close to the church. He parked near my room. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he said, "Funerals bring everybody back sooner or later." I said, "I guess so." He looked at me in the mirror again. There was nothing theatrical in his face, no smile, no expression that gave anything away. Just that same calm, familiar look, like we were finishing a conversation we'd already had before. I opened the door, got my bag, and said goodnight. He said, "Tell your mother I'm sorry for the family's loss." That stopped me. My hand was still on the door. I asked, "Do you know my mother?" He just said, "Have a good night." Then he pulled away. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds watching his taillights disappear behind the building. Even then, I still wasn't fully scared. Uneasy, yes, but I think I was still trying to force it into some acceptable shape. Small town, family acquaintance, somebody who knew my uncle, somebody who recognized my last name and enjoyed being a little strange about it. I went inside my room, locked the door, set my bag down, and sat on the bed. The room smelled faintly like bleach and old carpet. The heater kicked on and made that dry metallic smell they all make in winter. I took off my shoes and finally looked at my phone properly. First, I saw a missed message in the rideshare app. It was from Daniel, the real Daniel. The timestamp was from 34 minutes earlier. "I'm at passenger pickup outside door C, silver Honda Accord. I think you may be at the wrong area." I stared at it for a second without understanding. Then I looked at the trip screen. There was no completed ride, no charge, no route history, nothing showing that the trip had ever started. Just the original assigned driver, the same one from the photo, and a note saying the ride had been canceled after ride or no-show. I remember feeling physically cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room. I opened the profile picture again. This time I really studied it. The man who picked me up had looked enough like him at a glance. Same age range, same beard, same hat. But not the same person. Not close if you actually compared them. Just close enough for someone tired and distracted and expecting to see what he had already been told to expect. There were 2 more missed calls from an unknown local number, and 1 voicemail. I played it. It was the actual driver. He sounded annoyed more than anything else. "Hey, this is Daniel with your ride. I'm out front at door C. Been here about 10 minutes. I tried messaging in the app. If you still need the ride, call me back soon, otherwise I'm gonna have to cancel." That voicemail had come in while I was already in the other car. I sat there holding the phone, going back through the ride in my head from the beginning. He said my name. He had a vehicle close to what I expected. He looked enough like the photo. And once I got in, he kept me calm by saying things that were true. That's the part that still gets to me. He never needed some elaborate lie. He only needed a few pieces of real information. My name, from hearing it called or seeing my luggage tag maybe. My destination area, maybe from overhearing me inside the airport. Maybe from seeing the motel name on my phone screen. Maybe just from knowing where out-of-town funeral guests usually stay. The family name could have come from the obituary if he heard me mention it on a call, or if he simply guessed after connecting me to the cemetery road. There are explanations for all of it. None of them make me feel better. I called my mother first because I didn't know what else to do. She answered half asleep. I asked her if she knew any local man named Daniel or anyone who might have known our family and driven me from the airport. She said no, then asked what was wrong. I told her a shortened version because it was 1 in the morning and I didn't want to make it bigger than it was. She got quiet in the way people do when they're trying not to alarm you until they understand whether they should be alarmed. Then she asked me a question I hadn't considered. How did he know where to take you if the trip never started? I didn't have a good answer. I had never said the motel name out loud in the car. At least, I don't think I had. Maybe he saw it when I got in. Maybe my phone screen was bright enough. Maybe he knew that was where funeral visitors usually stayed. It was the only motel in that part of town unless you drove another 15 minutes out. Again, possible. Everything about it stays in that category. Possible. Nothing impossible happened to me. That's what makes it hard to tell the story without sounding dramatic, because the facts by themselves are so ordinary. A man got in the wrong car. The driver was odd. He reached the motel safely. That should be the whole story. But when you're the one sitting there in the back seat listening to a stranger mention your family like he's sorting through old memories, and later you realize he was never supposed to have you in his car at all, the whole ride changes shape in your head. I barely slept that night. I kept checking the window any time headlights passed over the curtains. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I still wedged a chair under the door handle, which I hadn't done since college. The next morning I called the rideshare company and reported what happened. They took the details, told me they were sorry, and said because the trip had never officially begun in-app, they had limited information. They asked if I had gotten the plate number. I hadn't. I could still picture part of it, but not enough to be useful. I told them the make, the color, approximate time, and pickup location. They said they'd document it. That was it. I also called the airport's non-emergency line and explained it there. The woman I spoke to sounded concerned, but practical. She asked if the driver had threatened me, assaulted me, demanded money, or attempted to keep me from leaving. No? Did he claim to be my assigned driver? Not exactly. He asked if I was Chris and I got in. Had I confirmed the plate before entering? Not fully. There was a pause after that. She took the report anyway. I don't blame her for the tone. On paper, it must have sounded like a tired traveler making a series of bad assumptions. Maybe that's all it was. The funeral happened that morning. Cold wind, wet grass, folding chairs sinking slightly into the ground near the gravesite. A pastor I didn't know, cousins I recognized only after hearing them speak, people hugging each other in coats. Normal funeral things. I kept expecting to see the driver somewhere in the background. Near the church doors, across the cemetery road, parked beside a line of cars under the bare trees. I never did. A few times during the luncheon afterward, I almost asked relatives whether they knew a man in his 30s or 40s, local, maybe drove nights, maybe knew our family from years ago, but I stopped myself every time because I realized I had nothing real to give them. No clear description, no name, no actual event beyond a ride and a feeling. Later that day, I mentioned it to one of my cousins anyway, in a casual way. He asked what the guy looked like. I told him. He shrugged and said half the county looked like that. He was probably right. I flew back the next evening. Since then, I've checked the plate and driver photo very carefully every single time I use a rideshare. I don't care if it makes me look rude. I ask the name first. I make them say mine. I check the car twice. And I don't get in if anything is even slightly off. What stays with me most isn't the idea that something almost happened. It's that I still don't know what, if anything, was intended. If he wanted money, he never asked for it. If he wanted to hurt me, he had plenty of time and easier roads to disappear down. If he was just a local weirdo who liked making people uncomfortable, then he put a strange amount of effort into choosing me and knowing what to say. I've gone over it more times than I can count. Maybe he had been watching the pickup area and looking for someone traveling alone. Maybe he overheard me on the phone with my mother while I was waiting. Maybe he saw the suit bag, the black tie in my hand, and guessed funeral before I even got in. Maybe once he had my name. The rest came from piecing together local information and taking confident guesses until I filled in the blanks for him without noticing. People do that. They lead, and you supply the meaning. That explanation makes the most sense. It still doesn't explain everything. Especially one part. A few days after I got home, my mother called me back about it. She had been talking to one of her sisters, trying to place whether anyone local might fit the description. In the process, they got onto the subject of the obituary and the burial plot. My aunt mentioned that the cemetery location had not been included in the public obituary at all, just the church service time. Burial was listed as private family only. I asked her if she was sure. She was. I checked later myself. She was right. The obituary named my uncle, the church, the viewing hours, and the family, but not the cemetery on the hill. That information had mostly gone around by word of mouth. Maybe that still means nothing. Maybe in a town that size, word of mouth is enough. Maybe the driver knew someone from the church. Maybe he knew the funeral home. Maybe he had some connection to the family that no one could place from my vague description. Or maybe he had simply been around long enough to know where that family buried its dead. I don't know. What I do know is that when I think back to the ride, I don't remember him as threatening. I remember him as certain. That calm certainty is what unsettles me now, like picking me up was not spontaneous. Like at some point before I stepped into that SUV, he had already decided that if a man came in late for that funeral, alone and tired and distracted, he would probably get in without asking enough questions. And he was right.